welcome back to YCR's Food for Thought series. My name is Hannah, and I'm a third-year-ish student at U of C in natural science. With me today is Sean and Miles. Miles, if you'd like to give yourself a quick intro.
Thanks, Hannah. My name is Miles. I am from Calgary. I studied political science at the University of Calgary. And in the fall, I am going to Carleton University to study international affairs. I've been with YCR for 2-ish years now.
Hi everyone, my name is Sean. I'm a graduate of International Relations at the University of Calgary, and then we'll be starting law school in September. And I'm a regional ambassador at YCR, originally from Burnaby, British Columbia.
Perfect. Thank you so much, you guys. For everyone that's just seeing YCR for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please feel free to connect with us at any time on our social media. All of them are at YC Resources if you want to learn more about what we do. We also have lots of fun summer events coming up, so make sure to stay tuned for those. We are super excited today to be welcoming Heather Exner-Pirot. Heather is a senior fellow and director of the Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment program at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. She's a global fellow at the Wilson Centre in Washington, D.C., the research advisor for the Indigenous Resource Network, and the managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook. Heather is also a coordinator at the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network and sits on the boards of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Economic Development Network, Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, and the Arctic Institute. Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot obtained a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary in 2011. Before I hand the floor over to Heather here, please note that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box below, and we will cover all of these at the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll get out of your way here, but we're super excited, and thanks for your time.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'll just pull up my screen. Now my screen didn't show up now, of course. We practiced this before. I can pull up my whole desktop. Let's see what happens. There we go. And tell me how this looks. How's that?
It's perfect.
Okay, great. So happy to talk about energy security today. It's obviously a topic that maybe was a bit in the background before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, but obviously is top of mind now. Governments, G7, OECD, International Energy Agency, everyone is thinking more strategically and trying to be proactive instead of reactive to some of the energy and natural resource supply issues that we're facing and that we're going to be facing more of. So what I want to go over today is just to paint the picture, lots of graphs, of how dire the situation is going to be, how much we need to increase supply, both of energy and resources from mining and food, and what Canada can do since the young Canadians for natural resources. There's tons for you guys to do. Canada has to step up, and we certainly have the ability to. So I will get started. So think about commodities too. So to think of it in kind of a more historical aspect, commodities go through cycles, and we often call them super cycles because they are often quite longer than financial cycles that we tend to have. And usually, globally, there's usually recession, kind of every 5 to 10 years, on average, every 7 years. Commodity super cycles are a bit longer than that. But the last one we saw lasted from 2000 to about 2014, and we had this commodities boom. And it is driven largely by China. China just had this, kind of ravenous growth, was growing by 7-8%, just unheard of levels of growth for a country of its size, on the back of its demographic dividend. It had its one-child policy, and at some point, its dependency ratio, the number of working adults coming out of this one-child policy, exceeded the number of kids that were under care or older people that needed help also. So it had this very big bulge of working age adults. The economy was growing, and it was ravenous for commodities. And so we had that great boom back in that day. And you guys are too young to remember, but around 2007, 2008, oil peaked at about $147 a barrel. but it averaged after that around $100 a barrel. That was the average for a couple of years, was $100 a barrel back in those dollars in 2010, 2011 dollars. So $100, that would be the same now as like $120, $130 barrel. So there was tons of investment in commodities. The Chinese invested in a lot of places, lots of people invested, but all this investment created inevitably a commodities bust, that there was overinvestment. And now we've been going since 2014, so almost a decade of underinvestment, that we are consuming more commodities, consuming more energy and mineral resources than we are investing in. We are living off investments that were made 10 years ago, not least by the Chinese. So that's the situation we're at. And a lot of analysts think that we're really at the cusp of another super commodities boom. And when that happens, there'll be a lot of implications for energy security. So why have we been underinvesting? A lot of it was just that people, we overinvested 10 years ago and there wasn't a need, that there was more supply than there was demand. And so prices got low. But there were some other aspects too. And certainly for oil, there was the ESG concerns, the environment, social and governance concerns. So it became popular to divest from oil and gas and other fossil fuels as part of, a movement to address the climate policies. And on top of that, you had much stricter regulatory burdens. It was hard to get approvals. It took longer to get approvals. There was more community opposition to resource extraction and all these things. So the long and the short of it is that we had a great 8-9 years where we had cheap energy, where after that global commodities boom, energy averaged about $60 a barrel for a couple of years on the back of the shale revolution. Mostly in the United States. The United States went from the world's biggest importer of oil to the world's biggest producer of oil, and totally disrupted kind of global energy dynamics. But now we're starting to see the limits of that, and again, expecting shortages in a lot of commodities in the years ahead. This will cause political instability and it'll cause more inflation. I'll talk a little bit about friendshoring and then I'll get into the good nuts and bolts of the data. But part of, when we're thinking of energy security, and I talked to Miles about this a couple of weeks ago. For many years, energy insecurity was the norm. And so as oil became the dominant source of energy in the world, it was concentrated in the Middle East. There wasn't a lot of production in the United States. There wasn't a lot of production in Europe, not enough to meet demand. A lot of energy importers in the rich world depend on the Middle East. And in the 70s, they used that leverage. OPEC members, we call them now, OPEC members use that leverage to advance their own foreign policy goals. So in this case, the war in Israel, and cause basically, a shortage of oil in the world, caused an oil crisis, an energy crisis. We saw that in the early 70s, and then again with Iran in a similar situation in 1979. So the 70s were full of inflation, full of, it was kind of the end of the post-World War II boom. And that's where the United States started to say, well, we have to do something different. That's where Alaska oil starts to pop up and more production wherever they could find it in the lower 49 also. Now, and then we got to forget about it because of the shale revolution, that combination of fracturing and horizontal drilling resulted in much cheaper oil from unconventional sources. And so the Middle East, it wasn't as important anymore. OPEC wasn't able to control global oil markets anymore. But so it's easy to forget for about a decade, the uncertainty. We had enough commodities. The commodities were cheap. Interest rates were low. Energy was cheap. Oil was $60 a barrel. From a commodity perspective, it was a very good time. It was easy for people to afford things. But that all kind of got shattered in 2022. And I'll remind people that actually the European energy crisis started in 2021. It was fall of 2021 that natural gas prices started to grow a lot in Europe because they had been underinvesting in supply. And it was actually because of that emerging energy crisis that Putin chose that moment to invade Ukraine, thinking that Europe was so dependent on Russian gas that it couldn't sanction Russia to the extent that in fact they did. Europe was able to manage cutting off Russian pipeline gas. It was very expensive and very difficult, but they managed it for a few reasons. One is they had a very warm winter. One is American LNG exports have just gone exponential in the last 7 years. So they were able to import a lot of US LNG. One is that they're still importing Russian LNG. It's only the pipeline gas that they sanctioned. And another is that they actually spent 800 billion euros in energy subsidies to help businesses and to help residents accommodate the higher cost of energy. But all of this is still causing concern. So now the Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese, the Koreans are all trying to get off dependence of Russia. And in many cases, sanctions don't allow them to depend on Russia for oil and natural gas, and now uranium, enriched uranium as well. So this movement of moving off of dependence on Russia, and then naturally also on China, we're looking very much at reducing dependence on China, is called friendshoring. And in a friendshoring situation, Canada and also Australia are likely to benefit tremendously. So obviously Canada is the world's second largest country. We have all the critical minerals we need. We have the world's third largest reserves of oil. We have tremendous reserves of natural gas. We have everything our allies need. And we are probably the most untapped geologically, where we still have, world-class deposits that are mostly still sitting there. Whereas the United States, Australia, even Latin America, some of those best world-class deposits have already, started to be producing. So we have seen in the past year, all of our allies, Japan, Korea, Germany, European Union, United Kingdom, the United States, knocking on our door, looking for bilateral agreements on critical minerals, looking for trade agreements, looking for some assurance, that Canada will start producing more of these critical minerals so we can get off dependence of China and Russia. So now into the fun stuff. How well equipped is Canada to supply these critical minerals and energy that the world needs as we try to get off this dependence of authoritarian countries? The first thing I want to point out is that Canada is not a mining superpower. We're actually the 8th. And we don't even make this chart, but if we did, well, I guess in this one we'd be 9th, but I think in 2023 we're 8th. We are not a mining superpower. So you can see that China's dominance in the mining sector is huge. This is just the production of metals. I think maybe some of you may have heard, it's very common to talk about their absolute dominance in the processing and refining of many more minerals. So copper, although they don't produce a lot of copper, they're a tremendous processor and refiner of copper. And a lot of us get our copper, not from, Peru or Chile, but from China after it's been processed there. And then you see kind of the usual suspects, US, Russia, Australia. The next biggest countries are also huge miners. And then we get into a few others. Why isn't Canada a mining superpower? Part of it is because so much of our geological potential is in the north. And our north is maybe some of the most tricky, certainly, to get into. There's not a lot of infrastructure. There's muskeg. There's no railroads. There's no ports. It's ice covered. The top third is ice covered. So it is a very, very expensive jurisdiction. But that said, the geological potential is there. Here we go. China is dominant processing. Maybe you've seen this is from the International Energy Agency report on critical minerals. An interesting thing when we're thinking about energy security, oil and gas is not geographically concentrated. There's oil and gas in pretty much every continent, and some might produce more. North America and the Middle East and Russia might produce more than they need, but there's still some supply everywhere, and there's refining capacity everywhere. Many of the minerals we need for the energy transition, so when you think of rare earths, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, and the copper, are very geographically concentrated. For all of those key energy transition metals, over 50% is concentrated in two or less countries. So either 1 or 2 countries accounts for the majority of production. And so that makes you very vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and makes those countries, Democratic Republic of Congo, Chile, Peru, Indonesia, very able to use their resources in a strategic and, from our perspective, negative way. And we are already seeing Chile and Peru talking about nationalizing their copper reserves. We're already seeing export controls out of Indonesia. And so you can expect when a country has that kind of monopoly, that they will use it to advance their interests. That's just the rational thing for them to do. And we had to be able to proactively manage that. And then you can see with the processing, China is just absolutely dominant. Whereas again, oil and gas is much more dispersed. We can see that OPEC, so OPEC is Middle Eastern countries, Venezuela, Nigeria, those are the major oil producers, and we call OPEC plus when it includes Russia. So OPEC plus includes Russia also. They had a much bigger monopoly in the 70s on oil supply, but especially if you see this arrow here, this is the shale revolution, where American production really increased, and again the OPEC's market share of global oil supply started to decrease. But everyone foresees that in the next decade, OPEC's market share is going to grow. Why is that? Because they don't have oil and gas divestment issues. They don't have ESG issues like we do. It's the Exxons and the Shells and the Cenovus's that have shareholders in the West, that have pension funds, that are large investors, that want to see this move away from fossil fuels for their climate policies. OPEC doesn't care about that. And so we can see that in the next decade and two, OPEC will start to regain that monopoly they have. When I say monopoly, anything over 50%, you have enough, control over the market that you can manipulate it. So that is a big concern. Is OPEC's again regrowing its share power. For the last 10 years, OPEC was largely neutered, I'll say, because American shale was easy to ramp up, and they just drilled, they drilled baby drill and they ramped up constantly. They never ramped down. But it was hard for OPEC couldn't manipulate the market at all, because the American shale producers was just take any opportunity to fill that market gap and try to make the money off of it. What is happening now is that as fast as US shale went up, US shale will decline. And that's the nature of the kind of oil it is, and how you get it, and the decline rate of the drill, and all those things. So everyone is anticipating that shale, and I have a few other charts of this, that shale is going to plateau, and then by 2030, if not sooner, start to decline. And again, the global oil landscape is going to look very different when the United States becomes again a bigger importer rather than a bigger producer. So amidst all this, and this is the only political slide I'll have, but there's obviously been a sense in Canada with the Liberals in the West, in universities, that we had that global commodities boom, and then we're moving away from a 20th century resource economy to a 21st century knowledge economy. And I think even a sense, and you could see commodities, as a lower and lower share of the stock market, whereas technology stocks were bigger and bigger parts of the stock market. But we're coming up against kind of the practical reality that your computers, your electric vehicles, your cell phones, everything is still built on mining and on an energy. And we now have 8 billion people. There's more hungry mouths to feed, and that number is growing and growing. We will never be done using raw materials. We will never be done needing raw, resources. And so where I think there is an idea in the West that we could be done with that, that was kind of below us, do resource extraction, didn't fit with our climate and our environmental goals. We're coming up against a more pragmatic approach, where now even the Liberals are talking about needing to fast track energy and resource projects. That was Chrystia Freeland in a kind of famous speech at the Brookings Institute in October. We have the critical minerals budget. We have a critical minerals strategy. The Liberals put in, Bill C-69, no more pipelines. They now promised in budget 2023 that they're going to reform it. It's only approved one project, and they're already talking about reforming it. And there's a long time where many of the Liberals wouldn't talk about oil. They would use the euphemism of energy. And here was Minister Wilkinson in the House of Commons talking about the need for oil and gas. Even if we decarbonize, we will still need those hydrocarbons for other projects. So the IEA says that we need 6 times more minerals to reach our net zero goals. Are we going to get there? No, the mines simply don't exist. So while we've been spending the last decade declining global oil, the E&P's exploration, production, capital expenditures. So the amount of money going into looking for new oil sources, new gas sources, and producing them. We have stopped doing that, even though last month we hit a new record in global oil consumption. If we wanted to reach net zero, the oil industry in the world is spending the exact right amount of money. So this is how much they're spending, $305 billion. If we wanted to reach net zero by 2050, that's almost exactly how much they should spend. The problem, of course, is that we aren't on track to hit net zero. So if we just had our current climate policies, we should really want the oil and gas industry to be spending $486 billion a year ago. So OPEC is saying things like, we are trillions of dollars short in how much money we are spending on oil and gas for how much we are consuming. And that means that oil and gas prices will rise. US shale is peaking. I mentioned that. So we had this tremendous growth ramping up. And now we see that they simply aren't able to do that anymore. And that the wells that they have, they've kind of reached their peak productivity. And the new wells aren't as productive. They're in kind of worse areas, not as productive areas. And so we are seeing already that plateauing of shale. But minerals are not keeping up at all. So we're spending less on oil and gas. We're consuming as much oil and gas as we ever have. We need 6 times the minerals to have an energy transition. And in fact, our capital expenditures in mining is like 30–40% less than it was at the top of the last global commodities boom. This is not going up. This is plateauing. So I like to say we need 6 times the metals. We aren't even at 1 times the metals. That we are living off investments again that were made 10 years ago by the Chinese. That is what's happening today. Just to have your phone and your microwave and your car today, we don't have the minerals to keep up, let alone electrifying everything and getting rid of fossil fuels. Mining finance, this is the scariest one, or the most dramatic. Mining finance is way down. So whereas you had 119 billion into mining finance in 2013, it's almost gone perfectly down in those years, down to 42 billion, 1/3. We have 1/3 of the investment in mining that we had 10 years ago. And I mean, there's so many, I had to choose which charts to show, because I could show a dozen different charts for each one of these points. Miners are making good money. As a portion of the money they're making, they barely have never spent less on reinvesting that into more exploration, into more growth. So instead of, they're making profits, they're making money, instead of putting that into new mines and new exploration, they're giving it to investors in share buybacks and in dividends. So as a portion of their earnings before interest, taxes, someone help me, something. So anyways, you guys know what it is. As a portion of the money that they are making, they are not reinvesting it in growth. So here we have all the states, the G7, we need more critical minerals. We have a critical mineral strategy. We have mining exploration credits. We're subsidizing EV battery manufacturing, and the mining sector is actually shutting in. They're saying, no, we're just going to sit on profits. We haven't made money in 10 years. We're going to enjoy making money. It's almost wild what's happening. Canada is not much, it's not really better or worse. Sometimes I think we feel like everything's always worse in Canada, but it's following roughly global trends. And so not reaching the peak from 2012 to 2013 at all, but we've seen a slight rebound since COVID, but certainly not at a rate that you would expect with the prices. And again, high inflation, high interest rates, supply chain issues, labor issues, long permitting times, hard to get, regulatory approval. It's hard to make money in Canada off of mining. In fact, we are producing less critical minerals than we did in 2019. So just, we're talking about it. The Liberals have the strategies. We have bilateral agreements with all of our allies. And actually critical minerals is going down. Copper, cobalt, nickel, zinc, uranium, platinum groups are down. Potash did go up. It was easier for Saskatchewan to ramp up, trying to replace Belarusian and Russian supplies after the war. Gold is up. because you know why? If miners want to mine, they do, they mine gold. So they find a way when they think they're going to make money for it. Gold is a huge hedge against inflation and volatility and recession. And so gold is up because investors are seeing, that this decade is going to be very difficult. Iron is up because of this giant mine in Nunavut. I want to make this point. We talk about critical minerals. What is a critical mineral? Is just a government designation to say that this is a very important mineral for our society or economy or the energy transition. So rare earths are a critical mineral, but there's, according to Canada, 31 different critical minerals. According to the United States, I think they have about 50. Gold. So our top minerals by value, gold, iron, and coal, are not critical minerals. So a lot of the money that, and about 45%, I think, of exploration money in Canada last year was in gold. So gold gets put in a brick and gets stuck in a vault, and it doesn't help the energy transition. It doesn't help make my computer cheaper. It doesn't help make my microwave cheaper. It's a safe form of money for an investor. But this is the point I want to make, is that even the money that we do see in Canada and the world is not heavily based on critical minerals. So all the numbers I just gave you that are scary, put it by a third. That's what's actually going into critical minerals. 2/3 are going into things that aren't critical minerals. And that's taking up supply chain, that's taking up labor, that's taking up available capital. So we're putting money into things that aren't actually the things that we say that we need for this energy transition. You would think that we would have more money going to major projects in Canada. Actually, the amount of proposed projects has actually gone down since COVID, since the war. Now, I'm just going to finish up because I know we want to get to questions to talk about Canada's potential. So this is the scary picture that I'm painting, and I think everyone should be unnerved by it, that we aren't producing enough minerals, and we aren't producing enough oil, and we aren't producing enough gas to meet the needs of 8 billion people. And that we are living off investments that were made 10 years ago, and those are soon going to start running out. And it'll take years for us to recalibrate. And those will be a very difficult few years. So what does Canada have that we could help? We have everything. We have everything that we could do to help. If only we would develop it faster and more affordably. So this one in particular is the Montney Formation. And then a couple of these are natural gas formations. It's not shale in Canada. I think it's sandstone, but the process, the shale revolution technologies are applied here. So it makes what used to be kind of, unrecoverable gas now makes it economic to recover. So the great big one is the Montney. Here is a word I've never been able to use in a sentence. It has 2 quadrillion cubic feet. So 2,000 trillion. I was like, why would I say 2,000 trillion? What's on top of trillion? It's 2 quadrillion cubic feet, 500 trillion of which are recoverable at today's prices. So just an enormous world, kind of a top globally leading natural gas reserve. And we have smaller ones, but still very significant all across the Western Sedimentary Basin here. And of course, it's nice, not a bad distance to get to Asia. And Asia is where all the population growth and all the economic growth is expected to happen in the next 20 years. So that is definitely the market we want to get to. So we have that. This is the top of Saskatchewan. So you can see that square there. This is uranium. This is the world's richest deposit of uranium. Some of the grades in the Athabasca Basin are so rich. There's one that was discovered where the grades were 50%, but the biggest uranium mine in the world is Cigar Lake. My husband's there right now. It has grades of 16%. That is a preposterous grade amount. Usually grades are 0.5, 1%. A great grade would be 2% for different ores. It is preposterous grade for a commodity. So preposterous that Cigar Lake is the most valuable mine in the world per ton of ore. That the amount of even though uranium isn't the most valuable commodity, but the amount of uranium in a ton that they pull out is worth so much, it's the most valuable mine in the world. There's bigger mines with more deposit that are worth more on whole, but per ton of ore, Cigar Lake is the most valuable, not of uranium, of anything. All the uranium in the Athabasca Basin with today's technologies could supply our energy needs and our allies' energy needs for centuries. It is a tremendous resource. if we move to nuclear, we won't have energy security problems anymore. The other nice thing is that, the next biggest producer is Kazakhstan and Australia. Well, between Canada and Australia, honestly, it'll be 7 generations, 15 generations before we have to start thinking about how are we going to, then we'll be getting helium off of the moon for nuclear fission instead. So this uranium is going to last us for forever. And then, of course, the other Athabasca, the Athabasca oil sands, 3rd largest reserves of oil in the world. Canada is the only non-OPEC plus country with oil reserves in the top 10. So when you're talking about when American shale declines, who is going to provide that oil energy security for our allies? It's Canada. The other ones are OPEC plus. Norway's reserves are not that big, and they're reducing. Australia doesn't really have oil reserves. The United States, at any rate, it has tremendous natural gas, lots of natural gas left, is still importing oil, crude oil. So anyways, this is where if our allies need oil and they don't want to have to get it from an authoritarian regime, it's going to have to come from this blue space. So just to finish off, I want to talk about, the implications that we don't talk a lot about of energy insecurity, and that's that there's poverty. If we don't have cheap energy, if we don't have cheap commodities, if we don't have cheap food gets grown through fertilizer and diesel, which come from hydrocarbons, then people, the bottom billion people suffer. And actually last year, this horrible orange line right here was the biggest shift back into extreme poverty since World War II. So the most people fell back into extreme poverty last year than have ever fallen back behind. Only 5 times since World War II have we seen reversions back into more extreme poverty. 3 of them are energy crises. So expensive energy is extremely bad for people, and especially, the poorest 7 billion people. If you think it's bad for you, just think of the other 7 billion people who aren't as rich as you. World hunger is growing. This preceded COVID and it preceded the war in Ukraine. For 4 years in a row, world hunger has risen, has doubled the amount of people facing acute food insecurity. That means they're on the verge of starving, and people will do anything. When you are on the verge of starving and your kids are on the verge of starving, that means political instability. It means terrorism, it means war, because you have nothing left to lose. 2023 will be the most expensive crop ever planted because of the cost of fertilizer and because of the cost of diesel. So food prices are very high. And I think I'll have to stop there. I could talk about other things, but I know we're ready for the questions. So all of this to say is Canada could step up. Canada should step up. If we get past this idea that resource extraction and resources are bad and agriculture is bad and that we should reduce them all because they emit a lot of GHGs, and remember instead that we should be doing this the most responsibly. We can do it the most responsibly. We can do it affordably, reliably, and help out the world by providing, these essential, necessary commodities that we all need for civilization. So I will stop there.